Have you ever wondered about kids who end up on the wrong side of the law?
You killed 2 men who did you no wrong.
Not just any trouble, but the kind that lands them in the headlines worldwide.
In the investigation of the death, Tiffany Unick, the defendant, Lionel Tate, for first-degree murder.
It's hard to believe, but some of the youngest faces have committed crimes so serious, they're not only in detention, they're behind bars for life. Today, we'll look at stories of the world's youngest convicts, and trust me, it's more complex and startling than you may think. Daniel Bartlett's tale. We head to England, where a story unfolds that seems more like a script for a chilling crime drama than real life. Daniel Bartlett was born in 1996, a child who on the surface seemed to have it all, a comfortable middle-class life, a normal family, but behind that facade there was something deeply unsettling. From a young age, Daniel had been drawn to the darker side of entertainment. Adult-rated video games, movies brimming with violence and gore. It's kind of like when we binge-watch scary movies, but for Daniel, it was not a thrill, it became an obsession. When he was just 8 years old, his parents had divorced, a blow that would send his life into a bit of a tailspin. Financial troubles would follow, forcing a change of school, and it seemed like the cocktail of changes became the perfect storm for what was to come. His fascination with violence took a disturbing turn. He began finding solace in soap operas, but not the lovey-dovey kind, the ones that were centered around murder. Red flags were raised everywhere, from his mother's partner to his school, where he had violent outbursts and even claimed to hear voices that urged him to hurt others. But after a mental health assessment, he was deemed to be a low risk. April 24th of 2011 would mark a turning point in Daniel's life. He had marathoned violent films and decided to turn his fiction into reality. Armed with a claw hammer and petrol, he then made his way to his mother's bedroom and committed an act that was so brutal, it's hard to believe it wasn't a scene from one of his movies. It didn't stop there, though. He set fire to the room to cover up his crime and spun a web of lies, blaming a fictional masked intruder. The truth was coming out, though. Investigators had found damning evidence on Daniel's computer, which included a story he wrote that eerily mirrored his real-life crime. It was like he had scripted the entire thing. In court, he would try to play the victim card, claiming abuse at his mother's hands, but the jury was not buying it. There was no evidence, and everyone knew that his mother was loving. He was found guilty of murder and then sentenced to life, with a minimum of 16 years in prison. The case would shake the community to its core, raising a million questions. How could a 14-year-old boy who was loved by his family end up committing such an atrocity? It's a haunting reminder of how the lines between reality and fiction can often blur, especially when a fascination with violence goes unchecked. Daniel's tale is not only the story of a crime, it's a wake-up call about the complex interplay of family dynamics, mental health, and the media's influence on young minds. Evan Miller's story. The story of Evan Miller takes us to a small community in Alabama, where his life would be led with shades of tragedy and controversy. At the age of 14, alongside with an accomplice, he committed a crime that would not only shatter a community, but also ignite a legal battle that captured the nation's attention. In 2003, they committed the brutal murder of their neighbor, Cole Cannon. What could have driven such young men to commit a brutality like this? As with many tales of this nature, the backstory becomes crucial. Miller's life would be anything but easy, a childhood that was marred by abuse, drug use, and mental health issues, factors that all often appear in these narratives. Fast forward to 2021, and Miller had found himself in an online hearing courtesy of COVID-19. He was clinging to the hope of parole, but in a twist that seemed something out of a legal drama, the judge dashed all those hopes, sentencing him to life without parole. It's a moment that crystallized the debate over juvenile justice. How do we balance the scales between a troubled past and the gravity of a crime? Miller's case had earlier given a flicker of hope to others in his situation. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled the mandatory life without parole for juveniles convicted of capital crimes was unconstitutional. This decision, while not directly benefiting Miller, had sparked a wave of resentencing hearings all across the country. It was a landmark moment that suggested perhaps that the system was ready to view juvenile offenders through a more compassionate lens. However, the state of Alabama would remain steadfast in its approach. It was known for its stringent stance on juvenile offenders, often handing down life without parole sentences. This stance would raise a host of questions. Is such a sentence fair for a 14-year-old? Does it acknowledge the potential for change and rehab in young offenders? Miller's legal team would fight tooth and nail, arguing that sentencing a 14-year-old to life without parole was cruel and unusual punishment. They highlighted his age, his immaturity, and the chaotic home environment that he had grown up in. But in the end, the arguments would hit a wall against the harsh reality of the crimes that he had committed. Thomas McLoud Jr.'s life sentence. The story of Thomas McLoud Jr. is a reminder of how a life can veer off course in the most tragic of ways. It takes us to Michigan, where 14-year-old Thomas and his friend embarked on a chilling spree that would lead to the deaths of two homeless men. Convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, McLoud would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, a fate that seemed almost inconceivable for someone who was so young. His journey to this grim destination would begin in 2009, but the echo of his footsteps through the corridors of prison still resound today. Imagine for a moment the life of a teenager behind bars. McLoud, like so many others, faces the daily hardships of prison, a contrast to the freedom and exploration that's typically associated with youth. There's a certain irony in how a place that's meant for punishment becomes the only world that one knows, shaping the rest of their life. One particular incident stands out in his narrative. After a phone call, he had found himself in solitary confinement for what was deemed to be an inappropriate conversation. This moment, isolated in a cell, serves as a metaphor for the more broad isolation and despair that define his existence in prison. Despite being one of the youngest convicts, his story is not unique. He's amongst over 300 prisoners in Michigan who are serving mandatory life sentences for crimes committed as minors. However, his tale diverges from what the typical narrative is. Throughout his time in prison, he's maintained innocence. While acknowledging some wrongdoings of his past, he also insists that murder was never the intention. His conviction, he argued, was partly due to his admissions during a confusing and disorienting police interrogation. Amidst the bleakness of the reality, he had sought solace and personal growth through reading. Books became his escape and a way to transport himself beyond prison walls. His educational journey also continued even as he was transferred to high-security prisons, which further limited opportunities for learning and development. Yet, his hope for the future behind prison walls and the day that he might regain his freedom remains strong. He keeps a close eye on legal developments, especially those that challenge the life sentence laws in Michigan, and as time marches on, he witnesses the signs of aging and the toll that prison has taken on his spirit. The fear that he may end up spending the rest of his life behind bars grows stronger every day. Dante Tillman and the path to life imprisonment. Dante Tillman's story is one of those that makes you pause and think about the complexities of youth and crime. At the age of 14, he found himself walking a path that would lead to life in prison, intertwined with that of Thomas McLoud Jr. Together, they would be involved in the death of 2 homeless men in Michigan, a crime that not only shocked the public, but also left a permanent mark on the juvenile justice system. Tillman's journey to this life-altering moment was full of challenges that many of us can barely fathom. His childhood, a mixture of conflicting experiences, where the line between innocence and adult culpability would be blurred. During interrogations, his mother sat behind him, a reminder of his young age. Yet, in the eyes of the law, he would be treated as an adult, responsible for heinous actions. His mother's presence during interrogations would add another layer of complexity to his situation, highlighting the struggle to comprehend the gravity of circumstance at such a young age. She advised him to reject a plea deal that could have led to a reduced sentence, a decision that would have significant implications on his future. The state of Michigan at the time of his conviction would be notorious for its tough stance on juvenile offenders. It held the second highest number of juvenile lifers in the United States. Tillman's case would stand out not only because of his young age, but also due to the brutality of the crime. Along with Thomas McLoud Jr., they would be charged for the murder of 2 homeless men and were accused of targeting defenseless victims, an allegation they both deny to this day. Throughout the legal proceedings, Tillman's confusion and the turmoil within became increasingly apparent. he was caught in a state of limbo, unable to fully grasp the severity of his situation. He waived his right to an attorney, but had his mother present during interrogations, one that would only add to his conflicted state of mind. The journey from a middle school student to a prisoner sentenced to life without parole is a harrowing one. His case, along with McLoud's, was a grim reminder of the consequences that follow when a young life goes astray. It raised critical questions about the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders and the extent to which a child can be held accountable for actions that are beyond their complete understanding. Lionel Alexander Tate's controversial case. Lionel Alexander Tate's story is one that rocked the nation and stirred intense debate over juvenile justice. His name is etched in the American legal history as the youngest person ever sentenced to life in prison without parole. The events which led to this unprecedented sentence began in Broward County, Florida, in 1999. Tate was only 12 years old when he was left to care for 6-year-old Tiffany Unick. What transpired that day would be a horrifying tragedy. Unick suffered injuries so severe they were compared to those of a high-speed car crash. This included a lacerated liver and a fractured skull, and the gravity of the brutality of these injuries led to Tate's arrest and subsequent trial. Imagine being in court at the age of 13 facing the charge of first-degree murder. The judge never held back in his description of the act as being cold, callous, and indescribably cruel. The case would further be complicated by the applications of the felony murder rule in Florida, which meant that Tate would be convicted of first-degree murder even without the intent to kill. The sentence would be met with a wave of criticisms. Many could not fathom how a child without clear intent to cause harm could be sentenced so harshly. It sparked a nationwide debate. Should children be tried and sentenced as adults? The controversy would center around the idea of intent and the capacity of a child to understand the consequences of their actions. In a dramatic turn of events in 2004, Tate's conviction would be overturned due to a lack of mental competency evaluation before his trial. This would allow him to accept a plea deal he had initially rejected and led to his release on house arrest, followed by probation. But Tate's story does not end there. In 2005, he would be arrested once again for armed burglary and robbery and for violating his probation. These subsequent crimes would lead to a 30-year prison sentence. The roller coaster ride of Tate's life, from being free to a life sentence, then back to free and in incarceration again, raised complex questions about the justice system's treatment of juvenile offenders. His case remains a haunting example of the controversies surrounding youth justice and the consequences of their actions. It reflects the challenges faced by the legal system in balancing the need for punishment and the potential for rehabilitation, especially in young offenders. Dimma AlWawi's short but impactful imprisonment. Dimma AlWawi's story is a poignant example of how the complexities of cultural and political conflicts can entangle the lives of the very young. At just the age of 12 years old, she had found herself in the middle of a situation that was as much about international politics as it was her own actions. Her case offered a window into the lives of young Palestinian prisoners within the Israeli legal system, a topic that resonates with deep historical tension. She would be arrested near an illegal Israeli settlement, charged with attempted voluntary manslaughter and illegal possession of a knife. Charges stemming from an incident where she was caught with a knife, allegedly intending to attack a security guard. This incident and her subsequent arrest would bring to the forefront a larger issue of Palestinian minors in the Israeli justice system. In court, she would be convicted and sentenced to 4.5 months in prison, of which she completed half. The cultural and political backdrop of her case is significant. According to data from the Israeli Prison Service, there were 438 Palestinian minors in prison for security-related charges at that time, a reflection of the ongoing conflict in the region. The return to her hometown would be marked by celebration, a contrast to the fear and isolation she had experienced in prison. The overwhelming joy and relief of her community upon her release highlighted the personal and collective impact of her imprisonment. Her experience was described as frightening. She had missed her parents, felt alone, and found the journey to court and the interrogations particularly terrifying. Her case brings to focus the realities that are faced by many young Palestinians who find themselves in the legal system. The political tensions and ongoing conflict create a context where children like her are often caught in the crossfire, both literally and figuratively. The fact that she was one of the youngest female Palestinian detainees at the time underscores the severity and sensitivity of such a case. Mary Bell, the young murderer. In the annals of criminal history, there are few cases as unsettling as that of Mary Bell, a child whose actions in the late 1960s would send shockwaves through society and raised profound questions about the nature of childhood and criminal responsibility. At the age of 11, Bell had committed crimes that seemed to be unthinkable for someone who was so young, forever altering how we perceive the capacity for violence in children. Bell's story takes place in Newcastle, where in 1968 she strangled 2 young boys, and the brutality of those actions were compounded by her age, making the case all that more disturbing. These were not simply impulsive acts of childhood aggression, but calculated murders, with Bell even returning to mutilate the bodies post-mortem. The trial that would follow was as much a media sensation as it would be a legal landmark. Here, we had a child barely in her pre-teens standing trial for murder. The proceedings painted a picture of a troubled young girl, with prosecutors detailing her chillingly calm confessions and the cold, manipulative manner in which she had committed the murders. The court heard how she strangled her victims, leaving notes claiming responsibility, showcasing a disturbing understanding of her actions. Yet in the midst of this dark narrative, there were glimpses into her own troubled background. Her mother's neglect and abuse, along with a chaotic home environment, had emerged as critical factors in understanding her actions. It would lead to debates about how such factors should weigh against the gravity of her crimes, and she would ultimately be convicted of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, a verdict that acknowledged her disturbed state of mind. She was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, the equivalent of an indefinite sentence for juveniles. The sentence would be a reflection of the judicial system, grappling with a case that had defied easy categorization. It was not merely about punishing a young murderer, it was about addressing the complexities that surrounded a child capable of such heinous acts. Joseph Hall's tragic circumstances. Joseph Hall's case is a somber narrative that goes deep into the tragic intersections of family turmoil, juvenile justice, and the psychological complexities of a child forced into unimaginable situations. In 2011, at the age of 10, he became a national headline for killing his father, Jeffrey, a known neo-Nazi figure in their California home. Joseph's story is rife with details of a life marked by relentless abuse and turmoil. His father was not only a parent, but a figure steeped in extremist views and violent tendencies. For Joseph, the household was a turbulent environment, far from the nurturing setting crucial for childhood development. This background became pivotal when deciphering the tragic events that would unfold. On that day, he took his father's gun and shot him at point-blank range while he slept. This action would be shocking due to the young age of the perpetrator and was a culmination of the incessant abuse and a desperate cry for escape from a chaotic life. However, the legal system would face a challenge: how to adjudicate a case involving a child so young, yet involved in such a grave action. During the trial, the focus would shift to his understanding of his actions and the interrogation process. His defense would highlight his developmental disabilities and inability to comprehend the gravity of waiving his Miranda rights during police questioning. The question then arose: can a 10-year-old truly grasp the implications of a police interrogation and the concept of his rights? His case would become a touchstone in the debate over how the justice system should treat children, especially those who have cognitive and developmental challenges. The conviction of Joseph for a second-degree murder charge and the subsequent 10-year sentence in a juvenile facility had sparked a more broad discourse on the capacity of children to commit adult-like crimes and the appropriate judicial response. It brought to light the often overlooked aspect of juvenile justice, the need for age-appropriate interrogation techniques, and legal representation. Anton Wood's transformation. The story of Anton Wood is a compelling narrative of crime, punishment, and eventual transformation, showcasing the complex journey of a young individual through the system. Anton Wood, a name that would later be changed as he sought a new identity, was at the time an 11-year-old boy when he committed a crime that shocked the community and set him on a path towards a life sentence. In 1892, Anton, driven by envy for another boy's gold watch and chain, had committed murder. His action, committed at such a young age, brought to the forefront the harsh realities of juvenile crime and the capacity for violence in children. The trial would be a matter of significant public interest, with the community grappling with the appropriate punishment for a child who had committed such a crime. The initial trial would result in a hung jury, unable to reach a unanimous decision in his sanity. However, the second trial brought forth a guilty verdict of second-degree murder. Anton, then 12 years old, had faced a sentence of either 25 years to life in prison or just 25 years, with reports conflicting on the exact duration. The verdict would be grim in the courtroom, with Anton weeping openly, regretting not have eliminating Joseph's companions as well. His time in prison would be a period of significant personal growth and transformation. Despite the prospect of life behind bars, he had found solace and purpose in education and the arts. The prison library became a sanctuary where he had immersed himself in learning, becoming fluent in French and German, and pursuing subjects well beyond his years. His talents would also flourish, and one of his paintings made it to the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. After having served half of his sentence, Anton, who was now known as Charles Henry, would be granted parole in September of 1905 at the age of 23. Determined to leave the past behind and start new, he changed his identity and settled in Wisconsin. There, he would meet Estelle Terry, and together they embarked on a new chapter far removed from the shadow of his former self. John Venables and Robert Thompson. The case of John Venables and Robert Thompson is one that remains etched in the collective memory of a nation, not only for the sheer brutality of their crimes, but also for the age of the perpetrators. The murder of James Bulger in 1993 would be a crime that challenged societal perception of childhood innocence and ignited fierce debates about criminal justice and rehabilitation. James Bulger, a 2-year-old toddler, was led away from a shopping center in Liverpool by Venables and Thompson, who were both 10 years old at the time, and CCTV footage would capture the moment that became a haunting image associated with the case. The details of the crime are distressing. Bulger was brutally beaten and left on a railway track, his body found 2 days later. The nature of the murder, committed by the children barely out of primary school, had shook the nation to its core. The trial was a media sensation that was marked by an outpouring of public anger and grief, the courtroom becoming a stage for a drama that had pitted a shocked public against the complexities of juvenile justice. The judge in the case had described the act as one of unparalleled evil and barbarity, suggesting that violent video films may have played a role in shaping the boy's actions. The convictions for murder and subsequent sentencing, detention at Her Majesty's pleasure without a set term, were seen as a watershed moment in the British legal system. It highlighted challenges of dealing with juvenile offenders in cases of extreme violence, and the case led to a reevaluation of how the legal system treats young criminals, especially in terms of anonymity, rehabilitation, and reintegration into society. In the aftermath of the trial, the societal impact of the case would be profound. The media coverage and public reaction were indicative of a more broad struggle to understand how children could commit such heinous actions. The case sparked debate about the nature of evil, the influence of media, and the capacity for rehabilitation in juvenile offenders.